content retention as a strategy is best understood in contrast to content attraction. I think everyone knows content attraction. That's how we launch and we build journals. That's how you build your community around your journal. And content attraction focuses on how you acquire submissions. So it could be journal reputation, community engagement, commissioning, increasingly so collections would be content attraction. Whereas content retention is the other 50%. It's once you've received the content, how do you keep it? How do you make sure that if an author is unsuccessful in their initial journal step, that you have something that fits a journal that can really meet their expectations?
Hello and welcome to Insights XChange, the podcast where we explore the forces shaping research, publishing, policy, and innovation. I'm Nikesh Gosalia, and today we are focusing on a shift that's quietly becoming central to publishing strategy. In an increasingly competitive and author-driven ecosystem, how do publishers not just attract submissions, but retain them? Joining us today is Oliver Cocks. Oliver works at the intersection of editorial strategy, product thinking, and author experience, with a strong focus on how publishers can design more connected, efficient, and author-centric publishing journeys. His work explores how content retention, workflow design, and smarter use of data can drive both better outcomes for authors and stronger portfolio performance for publishers. Oliver, welcome to Insights XChange.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. So before I get started with my set of questions, I just wanted you to talk a little bit, Oliver, about your journey into publishing and how did that come through?
Yeah, so I've been with Springer Nature in the publishing industry for close to 8 years now. And that time's really flown. But my entry into publishing was one from a research background. So I joined Springer Nature as an editor. Before that, I was at Syracuse University doing research in evolutionary biology. And I think my entry was I don't want to say by accident, but it was very much that I loved research, and I still do. I love research. I want to be involved with it as much as I could. And I think I got to a point in my career and in my research journey where I decided that actually maybe where my interest, my skills laid the most was not being the one to do the research, but actually to be the one to assess it. And so I left university, I left my role there, and I decided to move into publishing. And I joined Springer Nature, I think, actually, because during that interview process, I just loved the culture. And everyone seemed to have that same passion as me. The whole team and everyone that I worked with there really lived and breathed research. And so that's something that really appealed to me. And 8 years on, I'm still here, not in the same role, in a very different role now. But it's been a really natural progression in terms of my career to this point.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Oliver. In one of your recent posts, you frame content retention as a competitive advantage. What does content retention really mean in today's publishing ecosystem?
Yeah, I think first I'll start by saying that to a great extent, content retention probably isn't anything new. I think actually what's happened is it's just become more important, or it's become more impactful. And for decades within publishing, portfolios and especially successful portfolios of journals have really been built on content retention. Now, it might have been called something else at the time. It was transfers specifically, let's say, for one of those levers within it. But I think what's new, perhaps for me, as I work in content retention and we start to really evolve the way that we think about it and the way that we dive into different areas of those strategies, is that we're moving beyond transfers, and that actually the kind of the reach and the touch points that you can have when you start thinking with a content retention lens can be really dynamic and far reaching. And I think one of the strengths of content retention, before I get into the way that I would define it to you, is that actually it really helps you to understand the strengths and maybe more importantly, actually the weaknesses of your journal portfolio. It is holistic. And that's both a massive strength of content retention as a strategy, but also a complexity. So whilst I suppose I would define it and I think about it in a very simple way, it is quite an increasingly complex way of viewing journals and publishing from this top-down viewpoint. I think to me, when I explain it to people, I'd often say that content retention as a strategy is best understood in contrast to content attraction. I think everyone knows content attraction. That's how we launch and we build journals. That's how you build your community around your journal. And content attraction focuses on how you acquire submissions. So it could be journal reputation, community engagement, commissioning, increasingly so collections would be content attraction. Whereas content retention is the other 50%. It's once you've received the content, how do you keep it? How do you make sure that if an author is unsuccessful in their initial journal step, that you have something that fits a journal that can really meet their expectations? And fundamentally, when I talk about it, and I remember mentioning it in the post on LinkedIn as well, that it is, to me, explicitly an author-facing strategy. It delivers clear publisher benefits, of course, it has to, but really it succeeds when the author is the main beneficiary of this as a strategic initiative. And I think content retention really is all about competition. As a publisher, if we put our commercial hats on, the ability of a publisher to convert submissions into publications most effectively or efficiently becomes a competitive advantage, and that's why I said it the way I did. If we think about what it takes to publish an article, and as publishers how you create value, every article that you reject represents a cost. So as an editor, you spend time, you're an expert, you assess that article, you might invite reviewers, and so these costs add up, not only for the publisher but also for the author as well, right? If we keep the view on them. Now, I think often there's probably a misconception as well with content retention, in that it means you lower your standards in order to retain more content, and that is absolutely not the case. I think, whilst I talk about rejection being a cost to publishers, actually it is the value of a publisher. Your job is to gatekeep and to make sure that you only publish work that really needs to be published. It should be published. And I think it's this point that really differentiates a good content retention strategy from no content retention strategy, let's say. By finding that next destination, you recoup that investment and you can put it back into your journals and back into the communities that they serve. And so I think it's this piece that really becomes visible to an author, as well as the service that they receive. If you talk about content retention and further dive into it, what is it? What does it mean? It's really about making sure that we have the best fit journal for that individual research piece. It means that you should provide clear and accurate and informative guidance, and that those processes are smooth and ultimately enjoyable. Publishing and getting your research published doesn't need to be this big, scary, horrible process. It should be nice. It should be enjoyable. It's the culmination of years of research to get to this point. And I think content retention as a strategy can be defined in really two very simplistic but unavoidable pillars. Firstly, how good are your journals? How good is your portfolio? But secondly, how well can you direct authors between them? How smooth is that process, and how well do they move? So taking it back to the beginning, if attraction brings authors to a journal, retention really determines whether they stay and whether they come back to you again. So that's a long-winded way of saying it, but I think it's a really important question, because I think I would say between publishers, there's probably no single agreed definition on what it actually is. So that's my definition.
So thank you for sharing your insights. Just as a follow-up question to that, Oliver, do you think the content retention has become a more important strategic priority for publishers, or do you think it's always been there, but maybe become more important now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always been there, but I think what has changed about it is that content retention has become a much more important piece for work, and I think it really relates to how competitive the kind of publishing ecosystems have become over the last 20 years and how rapidly they've changed. Now, if I put my researcher hat on and I go back to it, there's an evolutionary theory called punctuated equilibrium, which essentially means that you have rapid divergent periods of evolutionary change. And I think I love to apply it to different kind of life experiences, let's say, and publishing, you could say, has gone through one of those phases. Over the last 20 years, not only is there dramatically more research output, but there's also more journals. So I think that the last count was something like 48,000 journals worldwide. And those journals serve almost 9 million full-time researchers. And so ultimately, content attraction is great, but content retention really is all about research quality and serving those authors and keeping them within your journals. So it can have a really disproportionate impact on your portfolios and a really disproportionate impact on those authors too. You know, we now live in a world where there's more research and there are more business models and probably many more complex business models as well that authors are served with. And so it puts pressure on those individuals. And as a publisher, it's your job to guide and help those authors in making those decisions. I think if you look at author-facing pressures as well in this ecosystem, the pressure to publish has changed. And so all of these things, I think, add up to making content retention, whilst, it's, like I said at the very beginning, probably nothing new. I think actually it adds up to making it much more important, a much more valuable initiative, let's say, not only to your author, but to a publisher. And I think you can really view it as, traditionally, you might look at a journal and the job that they do as to say, well, the only thing a journal should be interested in is attracting that research, and then their job ends either with publishing it or with rejecting it. And I think now when we deal with so much competition and we deal with the scale that we do, that actually it's not just about that single paper and getting it to that kind of publication endpoint, but actually to look at the full end-to-end view of an author's journey. And I think we know now that an author typically won't view a single journal submission as an end-to-end journey. Actually, they view it from the moment they start writing that paper to the moment it's eventually published. And for many, that will be more than one journal submission process. It could be two, it could be three, as they try and find the correct journal with the correct level of selectivity for them. And so within this process, content retention essentially allows you to build those relationships and to showcase the service that you can provide. Whilst an author is able to navigate choices more easily, even though so much has changed over those last 20 years. And so all of this compounds. And so you provide better service, authors enjoy that process more, they come back again. And we like to think about it really as often it may not be about the submission that you're assessing right now. And let's say I'm an editor and I reject it because it just doesn't quite meet the threshold for my journal. If I can help that author and I can provide advice that they value, they may come back again with an article that does meet my expectations and really is, who knows, a really significant contribution to the field. And so I think it's this long-term view which has become important. There is so much content now. We really need to start thinking about ways that go beyond that. And so I think that's possibly the piece that has become the most important about content retention. It is not new, but it is renewed, let's say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that perspective, Oliver. And in your opinion, what are the key levers that influence the retention rates? For example, how much, in your opinion, comes down to workflow design or the author experience, editorial strategies, or even portfolio structure? Or do you think it's a combination of all of those?
Yeah, the easy answer there, I suppose, is that it is everything. I suppose I would break it down into two core levers, and I touched on them already as well, in that if as a publisher, you have to make sure that your journals and your journals within your portfolio are truly excellent, that they're an attractive proposition to an author, and that they deliver on what they should, that they deliver on what you're promising. That's one lever. The other is then your operations, like you mentioned. It's processes, it's workflows, it's automation in some cases, and in other cases, it is the opposite of automation. It's personalization, and it's that kind of human interaction and touch points. I think often, though, these two levers have to be used together. So what I'm essentially saying is that if we take Springer Nature as an example, we're a big publisher. We have I think 3,000 journals within our portfolio, and so you need to understand how all of those journals work within it in order to make sure that you understand your levers and how you can influence retention. And I suppose what you could start to think about is how well structured are your journals, and do you have sufficient portfolio depth? Think of it like a matrix structure, and you need to make sure that kind of to some extent every square in that matrix is filled, that you have an offering for those authors. For smaller portfolios, it's probably less breadth and more depth. So for smaller, more specialized publishers, you still need a coherent and targeted portfolio in order to have good content retention. But it's really important to kind of accept perhaps that strong journals on their own aren't enough. And then actually you need to have excellence in your operational and workflow capacity, in your capability to provide service. And it's one thing to say that, oh, my journals are fantastic, but I can't get anyone between them. It's another to say, well, I don't have particularly strong journals, but I'm really good at getting them from A to B. So put those two things together, and your content retention effectiveness is probably not going to be that great. But actually, you do well in both, and I think you see disproportionate returns on that investment and that ability to guide and to serve those authors. So I think it's all about those two levers and how you get them to marry together. Of course, within those two levers, there's probably now 20 different kind of subspecialties, but I think you can really boil them down to those two, and understand strategically, where do we need to work more than the others, and perhaps who do I need to collaborate with to kind of drive one versus the other.
Got it. You've emphasized the importance of a seamless author experience. In your view, what are the biggest pain points authors still face today?
Yeah, I mean, going back to my research background, my time in research, publishing was painful. And I think it really doesn't need to be. It's a challenging process, and especially for early career researchers, those kind of just coming into it, it can be quite opaque. Very difficult to understand what's expected of you, and where you should go from there. And I think as a publisher, it's our responsibility to make sure that we minimize that. As I said, rejection is an important process. It is fundamental. It's how we protect research literature. It's how we make sure that only the research that meets those standards gets published and makes a contribution. But it's common. So why should it be painful? And I think as an author, when you've invested such significant time and effort in designing and performing and writing up your research, to kind of fall at the final hurdle sometimes can be the most painful part of it. As I mentioned as well, I think authors typically don't see rejection as the end of their journey anymore. It's simply about they've got a list of destinations in their head already, and they'll work through them. So as a publisher, there is an incentive to make sure that you help them collate that list, and you help them on that process to say, I can make this next step a bit easier for you. Let's take what we've learned from this journal and let's move it to the next one and make sure that you really benefit from it. Additionally, transfers as an author, because of that, are an expectation. It's not a shock to an author that they might receive some advice on where to go next. And an author's awareness or experience of that process grows year on year. So I think it's rejection is probably the most painful point for an author within this question, and they still face it, and they should face it where it's appropriate. But whilst it can be disappointing, there's no reason in my mind that the steps before it or after it need to be difficult. So when we start to think about content retention and what we do as publishers, it's our job really to find these efficiencies and improve those processes, remove duplication, and treat publishing the same way an author sees it, and in that end-to-end capacity. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure a number of authors are probably listening going, oh, that you've missed so many different pain points, but this is the one that I deal with, and this is the one that I see, and it's kind of my job to make that one better.
There's a lot of focus on improving systems, adding tools, increasing automation. How does personalizing the author journey differ from simply increasing automation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Firstly, I'd say that personalization and automation solve different problems. And with each, you have a trade-off. Fundamentally, I think the trade-off is author service, and you apply them differently, and you need to be really careful with the way that you apply them too. So I think as a publisher, it's easy to get sucked into this idea that more automation is better. And that's not always the case when you think about the experience that an author receives. Additionally, sometimes more personalization isn't really better because it's slower, it's less accurate, but it's about weighing those two things off against each other. Automation to me is primarily scale and efficiency. It helps you to move faster, handle repeatable tasks where perhaps people could be better spent doing other work. Something about like metadata, journal matching, workflow orchestration. These are all pretty clear targets for automation, despite their value. But they're largely a publisher-facing benefit. Whereas personalization is probably more about relevance or intent. So to an author, it's about understanding what I want to achieve and knowing that the publisher or the people I'm dealing with understands that, making sure that as a publisher, I'm giving, personalized advice based on what I know about you. And it's not necessarily having to know everything, but it's listening, and it's providing this one-to-one author service. But like I said, it slows things down, and it can be a real challenge. So, if you go any one way more than the other, if you over automate, you remove those human touch points. You remove the personability of it. You remove that connection that you can build with an author. And so, yeah, it reduces effort and it means things are quicker. But it also can mean, if we're thinking about how we measure performance, that actually things get worse. That you might be able to process more, but your effectiveness goes down. And so I think it's really about understanding what are the strengths of each, and applying them differentially. So personalization simply means that not every decision should be automated. And I think there are a number of those that I would probably view as sanctimount to that process. They are so important, and so they should really be ring-fenced and protected. So I'd say, automation, you could say, is all about executing, and personalization is where the decisions are actually made. It is very much about those processes, especially as we work in a kind of an ever more AI-focused world where automation can reach further and do more and be smarter. I think actually we also need to be smarter about how we use automation and how we use personalization to accessorize some of those processes.
So content retention requires coordination across multiple teams: editorial, product, data, maybe the commercial teams as well. For large organizations, and this is probably true for Springer Nature, but many others as well, Oliver, how do you build that kind of alignment within the organization? Is it challenging in the first place, or mostly everyone's aligned with some common goals? What has your experience been?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it really is true when it comes to content retention that it isn't owned by any one function, as far as I see it. It's a publishing strategy. And so this is something that from my perspective, I want people to be thinking about it constantly. And so the more people feel ownership of it, the better, the more progress we'll make. And really, because it's not owned by any one team or function or kind of department, really the success depends on how well we're able to collaborate together. Now, like you said, it's a challenge, but it is something which really picks up its own steam and momentum. And so because it's entirely focused on collaboration, my role as it is entirely focused on collaboration as well. And so there's very few things I can do in isolation when it comes to the strategy and influencing. But actually, I think that's the power of it. There are real, I suppose, operational things that we can control, and we can move those forward, and we can help in the way that we design the strategy and implement it and make sure that everyone's on board. But actually, it is something that requires as many people as possible pushing in the same direction. And I'm really pleased to say that from my perspective and the work that we've been doing over the last however many years, that is true. Like I said at the very beginning as well, when I joined Springer Nature, I joined because of everyone and how well they work together, and it's a highly collaborative organization in the way that we work within our research publishing department, and everyone is really aligned around the shared goal, and that's true generally, not just when I talk about content retention. But one of the things that I think really starts to create this culture is that you see the benefit when you run a journal, when you're an editor or a publisher on a journal, and you start to implement these practices, you see the benefit in the way that your journal performs. And so as soon as an individual starts to see benefit, you understand perhaps why that time was well spent. And so then from my perspective, like a content retention becomes a bit of an easy sell. It's something that gets results. So therefore people really support it. And I think ultimately there's also an alignment around why people are generally in publishing in the first place. And for all of us, and me included, it is about research, and it is about helping authors get their research out there. And hand in hand, that means author experience. With that in mind, in this viewpoint, it becomes quite natural and holistic, and ultimately, a lot of my job is to make sure that those things become actionable as well. I think whether you're an external editor or someone who sits on an editorial board, there are still actions that they can take as well, which really support this. And so content retention is something that is owned by everyone for the benefit of everyone, whether you're a publisher, externally, internally, whether you're an author or even to some extent a reviewer could benefit from some of these things too. And they really see it kind of are shown to strengthen the way that journals work and the way that the individuals surrounded by them can really benefit, whether it's around building and supporting communities of researchers and authors, or improving the experience of outcomes and encouraging good authors to return with their future submissions. I think to me, it becomes an easy sell because we start to think about journals as part of a wider portfolio. And when we start to have those conversations, people really gel with it. They like that idea of not being this island. And ultimately, that's really important. Journals don't function particularly well in isolation sometimes. And actually, it is about that ecosystem or that journal family as such that really drives performance. I think as well, if I go back to when I was an editor, that experience has been fundamental in enabling a lot of this collaboration and enabling us to understand what is it people need and what is it people want. And if, as an editor or a publisher, you understand the role and the position of your journal, what should it deliver, you can then start to understand content retention and the benefit that you can get from it a lot better within that cohesive portfolio view.
There are a variety of transfer and cascade models that have evolved, Oliver. I think I am quite clear on what does the success look like for a a publisher, when we say it's a well-functioning transfer ecosystem. But I'm just curious to know from an author's perspective, what would success look like? Because, and just I wanted to kind of maybe add something more to it. Do you see authors who share certain feedback around it, or because they've spent a lot of effort, their maybe first choice might be journal A, and then after a few months they might realize that it's not going to be journal A but probably journal D. Are they disappointed? How do you ensure success? How do you communicate or over communicate to make sure that they have a seamless experience as well?
Yeah. Often I think people would anticipate that the feedback from authors is really critical or bad, but actually you see the opposite. For kind of us as a team within content retention and specifically transfers as well, we have one of the highest net promoter scores in the company, and I think that's because of the way we're able to blend automation and personalization to the benefits of authors, and the feedback that you get is extremely informative in the way that authors are genuinely value this experience. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about, how rejection is inherently a painful process, but that what happens either side of it really doesn't need to be. And I think it's this destigmatization as a result of authors following transfer processes that makes you realize that this is just part of that process, and that as a publisher, the onus is on us to make sure that is true. So I'm glad that you focused on the author kind of side of success in your question, because I think there's obviously several very obvious and rather boring publisher-focused KPIs on how you measure success of transfer ecosystems and content retention generally. But I think it is all about the author. That's what we should be thinking about. We can't over-rely on just these internal KPIs when we're thinking about these strategies and how we measure it. I think if we do that, we risk missing the point, and you only get partial benefit. Ultimately, if you think about success slightly differently in that author-centric view, you start to understand that actually it's all about relationships and how authors are able to build relationships with their journals and vice versa. And this presents in several different ways that are beneficial to all kind of parties involved, whether it's higher author satisfaction or just stronger long-term relationships. So ultimately, when I pose these kind of content retention and the outcomes of it, I really want to be posing the question: did that author enjoy their experience of publishing with Springer Nature, or with insert publisher here in brackets? I think if you can answer that with a yes, then you're doing a good job, and the rest will follow. So yeah, I really enjoyed the way that you framed that question there, because I think that's exactly where you should be. And when you work in, especially probably larger commercial publishers, you will tend to think in basic internal KPIs, and that is your measure of success. But really, we need to go beyond it, and we need to start thinking about who is the author and what is their experience and what are they getting out of this.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. And I really appreciate and particularly want to call out, Oliver, the positive attitude that you just spoke about, because that's exactly, for example, even within our organization, I remember maybe about 12 or 14 years back, and we started to say, but complaint is a gift. And I think there's a book with the same name, apparently. And I maybe came from a different background, so I wasn't too sure. And, I was like, no, I don't think we should get any complaints, and, it should be zero. And this is a reflection of, our services, and just taking it personally, perhaps. But I think it is a great source to go back, look at your processes, to see what the pain point is. To also, like you mentioned, I did my research, I think, a while back, but it's extremely painful, and the processes and the complexities, and for quite a lot it is, rightly so. But at the same time, it's very difficult to navigate. And so, yeah, I think that attitude really helps. And that's why, I think, we've also kind of looked at the author perspective very closely, Oliver, and it's obviously very stressful and painful at times, but I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
Talking about research integrity, where does content retention intersect with research integrity and trust? As publishers think about keeping more submissions, I think we are to some extent in a volume game. There is the open access. There is more content coming through, maybe use of some tools, etc. So as publishers think about keeping more submissions within their ecosystem, how do you ensure that the whole speed and efficiency doesn't come at the cost of quality, rigor, author confidence, brand reputation, all of it?
Yeah, I think the two are, of course, very closely linked, right? But I think speed and efficiency, quality, rigor, confidence, they're not mutually exclusive of each other. I think kind of going back to the very beginning of our conversation today, there is this misconception that in order to do well with content retention, or in order to do well generally, you just need to publish more. And so you lower those standards and you start to publish things that which arguably shouldn't be published. And I think, I really push back on that content retention as a strategy is not about lowering standards or breaching research integrity. That is what makes publishers important. That is the position we fill, and that we gatekeep the research, and rightly so. It is the value that we provide. That being said, there is a huge amount of great research out there, and journal series which have really grown and come on in recent years are all about publishing with this inclusive lens and understanding what is a contribution and how that fits within those research ecosystems. What makes that research valuable in what it presents, and I think especially with regards to when we talk about reproducibility, this is increasingly important. So I think just because of scale or speed, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is kind of this trade-off with research integrity and trust. And actually, it is about understanding how you retain quality content and how you make sure it benefits the reader and the author that writes it. I don't think anyone has any interest within the publishing landscape of publishing research that is fraudulent or problematic in any way. And I think this is still true for content retention. It is about simply just being better sometimes at what we do, and using tools and data to help us achieve that, so that we can drive journal and portfolio performance.
Yeah. And just one final question, Oliver, and maybe, if possible, if there is a kind of a macro industry point of view that I have this in mind, not just, the Springer Nature lens as such, but if you step back and look at the industry as a whole, do you fear that we might be over-optimizing for submission volumes and throughput and some of the KPIs that we spoke about, rather than long-term author relationships? Do we run that risk if organizations don't focus so much on that? What would a more relationship-driven model actually look like, or are there any one or two quick best practices that you have in mind?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think when we answer this question, we need to remember that not every author wants the same thing. And so we really need to be careful, and I probably have done it at certain points throughout this conversation as well, of putting this idea of an author in a single kind of bucket. And in reality, what authors want from their publishing experience can vary dramatically. Some simply want to get published, and it may be a requirement of their degree that they have a research output, and so therefore they choose journals that align to those requirements. Conversely, on the other side, authors may be looking for impact and kind of really holding out to find that best home for their research. And so I think it's not as simple as kind of saying we over optimize for submission volume, let's say, but actually it's more about making sure that we keep that visibility on who are our authors and what do they want, and making sure that we we have something for everyone. And I think that way of thinking does relate quite strongly to relationship-driven publishing, and in the way that you understand your author and your author understands what you offer, so that you can work together to find that best destination, that best journal. So I think I'll answer your question by saying it probably varies. And we will see these dynamics change in the same way that we have over the last 20 plus years, whereby authors have preferred some things over others, and vice versa. I think this is, if I had a crystal ball to answer this question, I mean, I'd love it. But I think we just need to do our best to make sure that we listen to our authors and we listen to our editors as well, to make sure that we make the right choices and really serve those communities.
Absolutely. This has been a really insightful conversation, Oliver. So thank you so much for your time. And from my perspective, what stands out is that content retention isn't just an operational metric. Maybe it never was, but I think it's just become more important now, that it's just a reflection of how well the entire publishing experience is designed, connected, and aligned around author needs. And the author profiles and their requirements and their expectations are changing as well. So it's extremely important. It is a big challenge, but it's extremely important that any of these are not looked at as just as operational metrics, because some of this, there could be a lag effect, and you don't want implications either in terms of brand or submissions or other elements to come a few years later.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets more and more complicated the more you look at it.
Yeah. For our listeners, the takeaway is clear. Improving retention isn't about adding more steps or more tools. It's about creating a more coherent, thoughtful, and author-centric system. Oliver, once again, thank you so much for joining us on Insights XChange.
Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your colleagues. Until next time, this is Insights XChange.